Some very famous people went to Montessori school as children, and they actually talk pretty highly about its impact on their lives. So I wanted to share a few of these individuals with you, but I thought I'd do it in a different way by playing a little game, if you're up for it. So I'll read a quote from one of these famous Montessori children, and you guess who the person is. Pretty simple. So I'll give you a hint with this first one. The following words were said by a former Montessori child who happens to be one of the richest people in the world today. I mean, if not the richest. Here's what he said. Quote, "I'm going to guess I went to Montessori school about 1.5 years, starting probably at age 2.5. I have these very clear visual images of tracing out letters on sandpaper. I remember having a little special board that you can use to practice tying your shoes. It's amazing, I think, what a good program it was." End of quote. So, the question, who said it? I'll give you a moment and come back with his name, and then we'll get into a handful of other famous Montessori children, as well as some successful supporters of Montessori who might surprise you. The educator Dr. Maria Montessori once said,
"The child developing harmoniously and the adult improving himself at his side make a very exciting and attractive picture."
Welcome to Montessori Education with me, Jesse McCarthy, where we talk raising children and educating students while bettering ourselves right alongside them. Okay, the person who said the opening words about his Montessori experience as a child is Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon. His mom actually shared a funny anecdote a few years back about Bezos' early schooling. Quote, "Young Jeff would get so engrossed in his activities as a Montessori preschooler that his teachers would literally have to pick him up out of his chair to go to the next task." End of quote. Now, Bezos is actually in the process of building his own network of Montessori-inspired schools. He's committing literally $1 billion in these efforts for the programs. And they're in underserved communities throughout America, or will be. Anyway, on to our next quote. We will stick to successful businessmen on this one too, so that is your hint. This person started a popular company. To put it lightly, it's a company that I'm certain everyone listening knows very, very well. So here's what this individual had to say about his early schooling. Quote, "I benefited from Montessori education, which in some ways gives the students a lot more freedom to do things at their own pace, to discover. Some of the credit for the willingness to go on your own interests, you can tie that back to that Montessori education." End of quote. So, any guesses? Who said it? I'll give you a few seconds, and maybe if you want to cheat and Google his words, you'll find out who he is real quick. Well, if you were to actually Google the words of this man, you'd find out that he is Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google itself, and a former Montessori child, of course. And what's really wild for me is that the other founder of Google, Sergey's partner, Larry Page, also just happens to be a Montessori child. And he, like Sergey, attributes some of Google's success to that schooling. Here's Larry. Quote, "I think it was part of that training of being self-motivated, questioning what's going on in the world, doing things a little bit different." End of quote. So his words sound very similar actually to comments made by the former vice president of Google and former CEO of Yahoo, her name's Marissa Mayer, when she was talking about both founders. Quote, "You can't understand Google unless you know that both Larry and Sergey were Montessori kids. In Montessori school, you go paint because you have something to express or you just want to do it that afternoon, not because the teacher said so. This is really baked into how Larry and Sergey approach problems. They're always asking, why should it be like that?" End of quote. So in essence, these guys are non-traditional thinking businessmen or entrepreneurs, and some of that attitude, that approach, came from Montessori. Okay, enough on company leaders. We're going to jump to a different field, like in a huge way, and that is cooking. So the person who said the next words I'm going to share was a Montessori child a ways back. And unfortunately, she is no longer with us. But when she was around, she was the most beloved chef in America. Here's what this woman had to say about her early education as it relates to her love of cooking and aiding children in the kitchen. Quote, influenced perhaps by my early experience at a Montessori school, and surely by living in a clan full of carvers, painters, carpenters, and cooks of all ages, I am all for encouraging children to work productively with their hands. They learn to handle and care for equipment with respect. It is good to give them knives, for instance, as early as you dare. A knife is a tool, not a toy. A sharp, clean knife is safer to use than a dull, rusty one. Easier, too. A 4-year-old will discover that for himself as you teach him to slice a hard-boiled egg neatly and then to fillet a fish. Talk to children as you plan menus. Let their small, sensitive noses sniff the fish as you shop. Work together at the counter and let your children arrange platters. Nothing gives them more pleasure than setting things in rows and rosettes. The small rituals, like the clean hands and clean apron before setting to work, the precision of gesture, like leveling off a cupful of flour, the charm of improvisation and making something new, the pride of mastery, and the gratification of offering something one has made, these have such value to a child. And where are they so easily to be obtained as in cooking? The patience and good humor demanded of you by cooking with a child are a good investment. Do taste everything together at every stage and serve to children what you eat yourself. Once they have enough teeth to cope with any food, children, with their unjaded palates, are a keen, responsive audience for an enthusiastic cook. End of quote. Incidentally, that is probably the best description of food preparation in Montessori classrooms or Montessori homes that I have ever heard. Just such a huge cheers to this woman. So, who said it? Who is she? Now, if you guessed Martha Stewart, you would be wrong. Martha is still alive and kicking over at marthastewart.com, I think. I hope she's happy I'm giving her a plug here. Anyway, it's not Martha, but Julia Child. And Julia, she's such a fun human being generally. She has this great line, at least for me. Quote, maybe life itself is the proper binge. I just love that. Okay, now leaving the kitchen and maybe heading into the living room or library. This next quote is from a Nobel Prize winner in literature who was also a former Montessori child. He too is no longer with us, having died about a decade ago. In his autobiography, this man talks about how in his hometown, quote, they had opened a Montessori school. It was wonderful to be alive then. Studying was like playing, end of quote. And he adds, quote, I do not believe there is a method better than Montessori for making children sensitive to the beauties of the world and awakening their curiosity regarding the secrets of life, end of quote. So who is this expressive man? I'll give you a moment. He is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, author of many books, including 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. Okay, so far we've got a creative author, an awesome chef, a few ridiculously successful businessmen. Let's now jump to something completely different, to the basketball court, and a person some believe is the best player in the NBA. So what this man said is to the point and I think pretty powerful. It's, quote, Montessori has helped me become the person I am today, end of quote. So who said it? I'll give you a few seconds here. This was Steph Curry. Now, if you don't know Steph Curry, I suggest Googling him. This isn't just some random basketball player. Like, this guy is a superstar of the sport. Okay, so leaving the court now, I want to share my own personal favorite Montessori child. But actually, let's save her for the end. So before that, I want to quickly get away from former Montessori children and just mention a few very successful individuals who really supported and admired the Montessori approach. Now, this won't be a guessing game, though, as I'm kind of tight on time. So one simple quote to start is from Thomas Edison, inventor of the popular light bulb. He said Montessori, quote, makes learning a pleasure. It follows the natural instincts of the human being, end of quote. And I don't know if you know Edison well, but he was not the type to just throw praise around. He actually could be pretty cutting. He once had some devastating things to say about the traditional education of his time, which is not all too different from ours, I would actually argue, which is kind of sad. But anyways, here it is. Quote, the present system does not give elasticity to the mind. It casts the brain into a mold. It insists that the child must accept. It does not encourage original thought or reasoning, and it lays more stress on memory than on observation. The result of accepting unrelated facts is the fostering of conservatism that's in thinking. It breeds fear, and from fear comes ignorance. End of quote. That's strong words for sure, and which I have to say many of the old school supporters of Montessori agree with. For instance, when the late novelist philosopher Ayn Rand was asked what suggestions she had for parents who want to guard against bad education, and really to ensure that children actually remain eager to learn, she responded with, quote, the best antidote is the Montessori system of education, end of quote, which she then deemed, quote, an achievement of genius, end of quote. Now that is very high praise coming from Miss Rand. And then there's the late teacher of management, this is Peter Drucker, who had this to say about Maria Montessori herself. Quote, for thousands of years, people have been talking about improving teaching to no avail. It was not until the early years of this century, however, and he's talking about the 20th century, that an educator asked, what is the end product? Then the answer was obvious. It is not teaching. It is, of course, learning. And then the same educator, the great Italian doctor and teacher Maria Montessori, began to apply systematic analysis of the work and systematic integration of the parts into a process. End of quote. And I'll just quickly give you a few other big name supporters, and this is of yesterday and today. There's Helen Keller and her teacher Anne Sullivan, Salman of the online Khan Academy, Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, of course, and also just happened to have a Montessori school in his house, and Jimmy Wales, creator of Wikipedia. Now, I could go on, but I want to get back to actual former Montessori children, and my favorite one at that. Now, before I talk about her, though, I want to note that every single person I've mentioned up until this point, and that's whether a Montessori child or just an admirer, has said positive things about Montessori school. Now, I think it's important to note this, and particularly in the case of former Montessori children, because I'm not really here trying to cherry pick. I mean, I'm sure I could list off just as many impressive people who happen to go to traditional public or private school too. So I think there's a fundamental difference, and that would be that they, the traditional school successful people, they would not be raving about their education. Like, no successful person I've ever heard is out there going, oh, I just loved my experience in traditional school, learned so much, and you should send your child to it too. Like, nobody's saying that. No one. So the wildest thing about the famous former Montessori children I've quoted today is that they all talk about how great their early education was, or how much of an influence it had on their lives. So I just wanted to add that there, as I think it's meaningful. Okay, back to the little game, who said it? This will be the last one, and it will be a tad bit different because I will be quoting the parent of the famous former Montessori child. And there's a reason for that, which will make sense in a moment. So the following is this young woman's father, and his words offer a hint about who she is because he says her first name a couple of times, I think. Quote, Anne was a demanding character. She continually asked questions. When we had visitors, it was difficult to free yourself from her because everyone and everything interested her. It was good that Anne went to a Montessori school. End of quote. So instead of who said it this time, I'll ask, who is this man's daughter? So I'll give you a moment. She is actually Anne Frank, who wrote the famous diary while in hiding from the Nazis during World War II. Now, Anne happens to be one of my own personal greatest heroes. And as I found out years after reading her, she too attended Montessori school. And I think for the longest time out of the people I've mentioned today, like Anne was in Montessori for over 7 years, starting at age 4. Like that is a long time. And, if you've read and remember Anne's diary, you know this is one incredible young woman. And it's not like if someone found my diary at 13 or 14 years old, which would be an absolute mess if I even had one. She writes better by far than most college students, and really I'd say most writers. Like I'm going to give you an example passage, which just gets me every time. So here it is. Quote, "It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals, because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them, because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consistent of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out." End of quote. Now, less than a month after Anne wrote this, she and her family were discovered by the Nazis and eventually sent to concentration camps. As we know, she did not make it out. Now, I don't want to end on a sad note here, and I doubt Anne Frank would want that either. If you read her diary, you see clearly that this young lady, she's just such a benevolent and overall positive human being. And more than that, she made the best of her situation, which it's really inspired me personally in my own life. So if anything, please buy her diary if you haven't read it yet, or even if you haven't read it in some time. She's just such a bright, beautiful individual. And wise way beyond her years. Okay, that is all for Who Said It. Maybe this all wasn't much of a game, but ultimately I really just wanted to share with you guys a bunch of famous Montessori children and supporters who I appreciate. Now, one big note at the end here, and that's especially for those new to Montessori, I just want to emphasize that not all Montessori schools are the same. The name Montessori was never trademarked, so kind of anybody can open a school. So you got to do some research. So I'm noting this because although the people I talked about today had a good time with Montessori, or they find it amazing, they're talking about what they experienced as Montessori. And that might not be your neighborhood Montessori school. So, as always, again, do your research. I would hate to be promoting Montessori education and you walk into a particular Montessori school near you and it's just a big hot mess. So, just a warning out there. Okay, that is it. If you want references to any of the quotes I mentioned today, you can head over to montessorieducation.com, or there should be a direct link in the show notes. And then there you can also contact me, I'm Jesse McCarthy, if you like. Now, if you know of other former Montessori children or supporters and you want to share their words with me, please send my way, or just drop a comment somewhere wherever you're listening. Just ensure you have a primary source for the quote. It's funny. Sometimes I joke around that I feel like one day I'm going to find someone online or in person like claiming that Jesus himself was a Montessori child. Anyways, point being, please only share sourceable quotes with me where you can find the original interview or book or show, wherever the person talked about Montessori. So that's what I would be looking for. All right, that is all. Talk again soon, everyone out there, and adios for now.